Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the economy in China because we've just had the latest housing data come out. And if you follow the channel, you'll be aware that the housing market is really important to the Chinese economy. Historically, it's contributed around 25% of GDP. And that's not just the sale of property. Obviously, there are millions of people that are employed either directly in construction or sales or anything to do with the housing market. So this has been a huge boost to the Chinese economy over the last 25 years or so. And if we look at this chart, it shows what's going on with new house prices in China, which represents still the majority of the market. And as you can see, in May 25, new house prices year on year are down by 3.5%. And you can see from this chart that the scale actually starts at 0% at the top and goes down to minus 7% at the bottom. So in every single one of the last 12 months, prices have been falling. And if you think about that in the context of you wanting to buy a property, if prices are constantly going down, then it's not going to encourage you to make the purchase because in all likelihood, as soon as you've bought that property, it will be worth less the following month, and then the following month, and the following month. And if we expand the scale of this chart to show what's been happening over the past 3 years, so dating back to May 2022, you can see that prices have been in negative territory in virtually every single month. There was a very small blip in May 23 when prices rose by 0.1%, so virtually nothing. And that was as a result of the fact that the Chinese authorities made a big play. They introduced lots of initiatives to try to drive house prices up. It didn't work. And as you can see, since that time, house prices came crashing down again. And of course, one of the things to bear in mind here is that when we're talking about a fall of 3.5% in the current period, that's compared with what happened this time last year. And if you look at May 2024, you can see that house prices were down by around 4%. So you've got this cumulative impact. It's a year-on-year fall. If you look back to May 23, that was the one where it rose 0.1%. And then in May 2022, it also fell. So we've got a combined impact of year-on-year falls here. So this is one of the reasons why a lot of Chinese consumers have now lost complete confidence in the property market, because if you've got constantly falling prices, it just doesn't encourage anybody to buy. And also, if you're a property development company, it makes it very difficult to actually make any profit because in all likelihood, your costs are going up. You're paying your people more. You're paying more for raw materials. So you've got increasing costs at a time when your sales price is actually going down. So that's going to cut into your profit margin. And quite frankly, there aren't many property development companies in China that are actually making any profit at the moment. Anyway, most of them are shipping huge losses and most of them are being bailed out by the government, the ones that are still surviving. And if we look at this chart, it shows the actual year-on-year sales. So looking at what's going on in actual sales terms. And once again here, the latest data shows that sales are down significantly, around 10%. If we look at the scale of this chart, it goes from 36% at the top to minus 70% at the bottom. Minus 70%. When we're talking about the housing market in most countries, there is a crisis going on if we see a 2 or 3% fall in volumes. When you're looking at the sort of fall in volumes that China has experienced over the past 3 years, it is quite mind-bending. So if we look back to May 2024, we had a 36% year-on-year fall in the volume of sales. In May 23, it was down by around 10%. And in May 22, you can see that it was down by more than 60%. And once again, if you apply the cumulative effect of this, if you add on top all of these falls, we're looking at more than 100% fall in the value and volume of sales in China over the past 3 years. And clearly, that's disastrous in any market. But the problem in China is that the amount of things that individuals are allowed to invest into is relatively limited. And housing back at the start of this century was seen to be the big thing for everybody to get into. The property market was opened up to all consumers. And in the first 20 years, through to around 2021, house prices continually went up. So a lot of Chinese individuals have put their life savings into this market. It's estimated that around 70% of all of China's wealth is tied up in property. But the problem that you've got now, as we've seen from these charts, is because the price of property and the value of the market is going down year on year and month on month. That means that everybody is now feeling less wealthy. If you think about it in your own context, if you own a property that maybe you bought 30 or 40 years ago, that property will have increased in value probably multiple times. So whatever you paid for it 20 years ago, it's probably worth double that today in most economies. And that basically makes you feel more wealthy, even though you can't cash it in. You can't actually use it like a bank account and draw the money out unless you take some sort of equity release product, which I'm not suggesting. But if you just think, well, my house is now worth double what it was when I bought it, or three times if you bought it a long time ago, you automatically think, well, actually, I'm doing quite well. And therefore, you'll be encouraged to spend money. But if the opposite is happening, if what's going on in China was happening to you, where you bought your property and it's now worth maybe half of what it was worth when you paid for it, then you'd be feeling quite worried about that, because you might have a mortgage that you've still got to pay off and you've got a property that maybe you're in negative equity on. So those sort of feelings don't encourage you to spend money. So that's one of the problems in China at the moment, is that the fall in the property market that is continuing to go on. It's been going on for 3 years now. It's a really long period for the housing market to be in the doldrums. It's having a negative impact on consumer sentiment. It means that they don't want to buy property anymore, but also they're becoming more cautious in terms of what they're doing with their money. Now, if we have a look at what's going on with unemployment in China, the latest data shows that it's now at 5%. And that I wanted to show this chart, which shows the situation over the last 10 years. And you can see that 10 years ago, through to 2018, unemployment was sitting around about 4%, which is broadly speaking where it is in the USA at the moment. It's at 4.2%, the latest data. And I think that's probably an acceptable level for most developed economies. But as you can see, in 2018, when there was a downturn in the global economy, there was a sharp increase in unemployment and it jumped up to 5%. And then in 2020, with the COVID pandemic, it had jumped above 6%. And since that time, we've seen unemployment staying at high levels in China. It hasn't returned back to that 4% level. And one of the reasons for that is because there's less demand for the manufactured products coming out of China. Now, none of this data here takes into account what's going on with Donald Trump's tariffs, where Donald Trump has launched this trade war where the tariffs at one point rose to 145%. Now, it's been reported that a trade deal has now been signed between the USA and China, but we haven't really seen the full details of that. We don't really know what the long-term issue is going to be for Chinese exports, because they're still facing significant sanctions as a result of the fentanyl problem, where Donald Trump has accused China of allowing the precursor drugs to be made in China and then exported into the USA. And there are also restrictions in terms of things like aluminium and steel and various other different bits and pieces. So it's likely that as we go through the rest of 2025, China will see an impact on its exports into the USA because they're going to be more expensive, even if the deal agrees a 10% tariff on top of the 30% tariff for the fentanyl. That's an extra 40% on top of the prices that China was selling before Donald Trump took over as president. So it's likely that China will lose more sales and therefore unemployment might go up. But whilst this unemployment data looks worrying, this unemployment data looks very concerning, and this is youth unemployment. So this is people up to the age of 24 in China, so between 16 and 24, that are officially looking for work, so not in higher education. And you can see that the latest data shows that youth unemployment is running at 15.8%. Now, that is a really high percentage because those people are needing to start their careers. They need to get onto the job ladder so that they've then got progression over the next 40 or 50 years. But 15.8% is a serious problem. And as you can see, over the past 12 months, it's actually been at higher levels than that. At one point in August 24, it was almost 19%. And I think what's interesting about this data, if you've been following the channel, you'll be aware of this, is that the figures historically were actually higher than this. They were in the 20s of percent. But China then changed the way they were producing the data to exclude a huge chunk of the youth. But what this data tells us is that there is a problem building in China going forward, because if young people are not entering the job market, then what are they going to do? Are they going to become long-term unemployed and add to that 5% total? And I think what's worrying for China is that they have a very low retirement age. So the current official retirement age, if you're a woman in China that's working in a factory, the blue collar sector, the official retirement age right now is 50.3 years. Now, there is a plan to increase this to 55. So it's going up by 1 month every 2 months at the moment. So it will be up to 50.5 years at some point over the next couple of months, and gradually it will get up to 55. But 55 is still very young to be retired. So because they've got a low retirement age, you would have thought that there's lots of people retiring each year and therefore there's lots of jobs available to the youth, but that's obviously not what we're seeing. And if we compare that age of 50 to the rest of the G20, so these are the 20 largest economies in the world, you can see that 50 is completely out of kilter with every other country. The next closest is Turkey, where the retirement age for women is 58. It's also 58 in Russia. It's 59 in Indonesia. And then we've got a number of countries at 60, South Korea, South Africa, Saudi Arabia, and India. Brazil is at 62, France just under 63, Singapore 63, Switzerland 64. The Eurozone is just under 65. And then we've got a bunch of countries that are at 67 at the bottom here. And the countries that are at 67 are basically saying there is no difference between the male and female retirement age. If you're looking for equality in terms of the workforce, then obviously you need to retire at the same point. You can't have everything being equal apart from your retirement date. Why does it work that you can have equal rights and equal pay and equal everything else, but then you retire 5 years earlier? It doesn't actually make any sense to do that. But then doing that in China at the moment. And if we have a look at the male retirement age, it's currently at 60.3 years. And it's the same concept here, whereby the retirement age is increasing by 1 month every 2 months. So it will increase by 6 months every year, basically, up until 65. So that's the new cap that China has set. So the goal is to get to 65 by 2040. And the goal for women is to get to 55 by 2040. So still got quite a long way to go just yet. And if we compare that retirement age to the rest of the G20, you can actually see that there are some countries that have got a lower retirement age for men. Indonesia, it's 59. Turkey, South Korea, South Africa, and Saudi Arabia and India, it's 60. China is now slightly higher than that, 60.3. France, just under 63. Singapore is 63, along with Russia. Eurozone, just under 65. And then we've got a load of other countries at 65 through to 67. But the reason for talking about this is that China is building real problems for itself because it's got an aging population because of the one-child policy that was introduced back in the 80s and that stayed in place for a long time, for many decades. And the reason why that's changed the position in China is that firstly, they've got a reducing number of births, so they don't have a lot of young people coming through, so that's why they've got a top-heavy pyramid. But secondly, even though they've now watered down the one-child policy, it's instilled a mentality into Chinese people. They don't want big families. And in fact, there's a problem in China right now with regards to the young people not wanting to get married and have children. So we're seeing a completely different cultural shift to what we had maybe 100 years ago in China, where you got married young and had lots of children. And the problem that this is now causing is that there's a lack of fresh blood coming into the workforce. But what we're seeing is that people are retiring much earlier than they are in other countries around the world. That's creating a big bunch of people who need to be supported by the state. So they will need to be given state pensions. They're not building up as much company pension because they're only working until they're 50 or 55 or 60 or whatever the age is when people are retiring. So they've got a shorter work life. That means they're building up less of a pension pot. And somebody is going to have to support all of these people. And with the high levels of youth unemployment that we're seeing in China, that's causing a problem because you've got people retiring early. So you've got lots of people exiting the workforce at the top, but you don't have a lot of people joining because we've got this 15.8% unemployment problem. So you can start to see the real problems that are forming for the next 10 to 15 to 20 years in China. We've talked a lot about the immediate problems, but there are some certain long-term problems. Now, jumping back to that immediate problem, we've talked about this in other videos, but I thought I'd raise it again now. Currently, China is experiencing deflation. So year on year, the latest data for May shows that prices are down by 0.1%. And this is the fourth consecutive month that China's experienced deflation. And the problem with deflation, whilst it represents reasonable news for consumers because prices aren't going up, so things are a little bit cheaper, it's a major problem for companies in China because they can't pass on any cost increases in their prices. And if we have a look at what's been going on with producer prices, you can see that they've been in negative territory in China since October 2022. So in every single month, virtually, for the last 2.5 years, prices have been going down. And once again, there is a cumulative impact here. In May 23, producer prices fell by more than 5%. But in May 24, they also fell by 3%. So you've got a cumulative impact because you're comparing with this time last year. And if they fell by 3% this year, but 5% last year, then that means in rough terms, they're down by 8% compared with the previous year. And then obviously we've got a further fall of 3.5%. So we've got year on year serious falls in prices. These are not small falls. These are absolutely huge if you're a company in China right now. And the problem that's causing these companies is that they're making bigger losses today than they were this time last year and in the previous year. And it's now estimated that more than 50% of companies in China are making losses, and the situation is obviously getting worse. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because what's going on in the housing market is still really important for the Chinese economy because it still contributes around 25% of GDP. But what we've seen in today's video is that house prices are continuing to fall. They have now been falling for almost 3 years in China consecutively. And we're also seeing a fall in the volume and the value of sales. And what that tells us is that firstly, companies that are involved in the property sector in China are still struggling. They're still not making any profit. In fact, they're making losses, but they're no longer employing as many people, and the ancillary businesses. So when you think about if somebody buys a property, they will have to furnish that property. So they'll have to go out and buy a bed and a sofa and some furniture and carpets and all of those sort of things. So all of the companies that are involved in those trades all benefit when the housing market is booming. And you also have lots of jobs in things like estate agents and people who are actually selling the properties, and then people who are selling Lamborghinis to the guys who own the property development companies. They're making lots of money, all of those sorts of things. But when you've got the reverse situation, when you've got a falling market where nobody's buying property and nobody's actually buying those new apartments, then you don't need all of those carpets and beds and sofas and Lamborghinis. So all of those other businesses that rely upon the property sector are now struggling because there's been a huge fall in the demand for their services. So you can see the knock-on impact of the fall in the house market. It's not just the property development companies. But more importantly than that, The problem that this has now embedded into the Chinese economy is that Chinese consumers became very comfortable with the property market. It was seen as being the new thing to invest into. And for 20 years, lots of people put their life savings into that market. And what they are seeing now is the value of their life savings going down because the property that they bought is falling in value. It's worth less today than it was this time last year and the year before and the year before that. So, virtually anybody that's bought a property in the last 3 years in China is sitting in negative equity. And when you have negative equity on your property, like any investment that you make, it suddenly makes you more cautious. You start thinking, I shouldn't have bought that. I need to think about what I'm doing with my money. I'm going to be a little bit more frugal, maybe not spend as much this month, maybe save a little bit more for a rainy day just in case I have to sell that property and then I have to pay off the mortgage and I don't have enough money. So that sort of mentality is now changing consumer spending in China. And that's one of the reasons why the Chinese economy is seeing deflation, because Chinese companies are struggling to sell their products, so prices have had to be reduced to encourage people to buy more. And we've seen that China has now had 4 consecutive months of deflation, and that's a major problem for Chinese companies because they've got rising costs. They're paying their people more, they're paying more for raw materials and fuel and energy and those sorts of things, but they can't pass on any of those price increases, their cost increases, in terms of prices because prices are going down. And that means that they're having to absorb all of those cost increases. That's reducing their profitability. And over 50% of companies in China are now making losses. So the overall summary of today's video is that the situation in the Chinese economy, putting Donald Trump's tariffs aside for a moment, is getting worse. The housing market, which is the bedrock of the whole economy, is still in the doldrums. It's still seeing falling prices and values and volumes. That's causing problems for the property companies, the associated businesses, and the people in China are seeing the value of their investments going down, and that is a major problem. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative, and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and thank you so much to everyone that's supporting me. If you've bought me a coffee or sent me YouTube super thanks, thank you so much, really appreciate that. And if you're a long-term supporter, either through Patreon or YouTube membership or Buy Me a Coffee membership, thank you for that support. Really helps to keep me motivated. And here's something to put a smile on your face.